Well, greetings to all in memorial and those who would be looking in on our conversation. This is the post-sermon conversation for Mother's Day. And on that day, we had an interview. I was looking for a mom that I respected and had talked to a couple, and in a conversation with my wife, who is featured here, Heather Thornton. In our conversation, it occurred to me, and I think almost you at the same time, that the sensitivities we're trying to speak to, because Mother's Day, like many things in our culture, we realize that just how everybody experiences it differently. But as we talk through the dynamic, it became clear that you've experienced so much, so many different interfaces with motherhood. And I decided to call it the motherhood of God, both because God himself, even at Genesis 1:27, says that when he created man and woman, he created man and woman in his image. So this isn't something cutting edge or new age. It's just it's the truth that out of God comes the aspect of father and mother. And yes, he addresses himself as father the majority of the time, but multiple times he brings up the fact that he is like a mother. And in the interview that came up from you as well, Heather. And so what we did is we walked through these different dynamics of her as an adopted child, her as a person wanting to have children and experiencing infertility, as a person who lost a child, and then after a couple months of life, and then 3 miscarriages, as a mom who has functioned as a mom in people's lives that weren't her children, foster care, and there were other people you could have brought up, but a lady that goes to church with us as well, and then our living children. And so you just kind of, and in our conversation, you were sharing, and we're trying to really bring it down to what are the main lessons, what are the main ways you saw God's motherhood show up to you. And there's always this symbiotic, interactive relationship we have in this, because as I know things in myself that are good, I'm noticing the things of God, and vice versa. When I notice things of God, I'm like, oh wait, I also see aspects of that in myself, because that is God in me coming through. And so I just want to begin. How did that feel? A lot of times we'll talk. I think I told you I was going to ask you the first question. I don't remember what that was now. So your actual question is, how did it feel? It was very new to you. That is not something you enjoy, being up in front of a group, even in an interview format. And so I was just curious, how did you experience that?
Certainly all the nerves and all of that just comes with sharing personal journeys publicly.
Mm-hmm.
But I will say that when you started to ask questions and when we were having the conversation, I don't think I had ever really been afforded the opportunity to reflect on my whole journey of motherhood through the lens of what God was teaching me about himself. Certainly when you're going through each individual thing, whether it's struggling with infertility or the questions I would ask about adoption, or foster care and just the normal things of parenting, all of those things have lessons and struggles that God wove deep lessons into. But the chance to reflect on them collectively certainly brought about insight that I didn't appreciate to the full degree that combining it to share in such short format made me appreciate, and it made me see again, even what I was sharing, the intentionality of how God uses our everyday circumstances to teach us really profound things about his relationship with us and to us that we might not get just in theory if we weren't experiencing those things. And it's funny because what Lisa shared in her thoughts on communion afterwards actually even added layers to what I was thinking about, specifically when she just shared about why God allowed Mary to witness as a mom the death of her son,
Right.
and that she might not otherwise be watching for the resurrection.
Hmm.
And how on one level it's so personal as a mom to experience death, but then also on another level, how personal it becomes, not just to witness resurrection for the child that you lost, but to witness resurrection for yourself.
Yeah.
And I think that those truths are woven through our everyday experiences, no matter what they are. But certainly in motherhood, there are things I learned about God's mothering of me and parenting of me that I would have never grasped had I
Yeah.
not gone through the difficulties.
I think two things that are really important in what you just said is being able to take stock of what has God actually done in my life. I think a a tremendous amount. I was going to come up with a statistic, but I just be making it up, but tremendous amount of Christians, of disciples of Jesus, they don't think they really have a story unless they have some kind of incredible story where they bottomed out, where things went horrible for them. I think the vast majority of Christians don't believe they have much of a story. And I think it's because maybe even the church has given them the impression that if you just haven't gone to a mission field, if you haven't had a crisis that is just devastating, then you don't have a story. And the real cost of that is that if I don't think the things I've experienced are remarkable, then I don't notice God, and then I don't look for God looking forward. And I think it really costs us a lot to not have every single Christian take time with God and say, God, walk me back through my story. And we started at our church with what we called My Five Things. And it was just to get people to recognize there were big things that happened in your life, even if you didn't think much of it. And then when you started seeing it, people would say, after you were done sharing your story, they would say, here's how I saw God in you. Because we wanted to train our people, all of Memorial, to notice, man, God's been at work. Now we shifted that to disciple stories, but it's the same dynamic, is really noticing God working in you. And the other thing is this, I think because so many of us were raised that the Holy Spirit was his only job was to bring the Bible together. And then it's kind of the at least the inference was, now you're on your own. Here's the Bible. Now you go do this. As if your learning capability determined how much God would work in your life. You had to master the material, is the way I say it. But really, if you watch the people in the Bible who did not have a Bible, I want to just point out, even the people in the New Testament didn't have access to much, if any, of the Old Testament. In terms of the individual, didn't have much access. And I think this idea of being surprised how much life teaches us, I think it shouldn't be that way. I think we should assume I would read the living and active word and then continue to be taught by the Spirit in my living and active life. And that was always built that way, and it comes down again to this idea of, if I'm not looking for something, I probably won't find it. And Jesus says this clearly in Matthew 6, if you seek, you will find. So if you reverse that, if you don't seek, you will not find. So if you're listening to this and you're like, man, I just feel like God's not in my life, I think there's that could be a big part of it, is that we get so focused on our problems or focused on the messages about us in our heads that we stop looking for God. And the beauty is, you could have had a mess of a life, or a life you didn't even appreciate up to this moment. And if you start looking for God, you will start finding him. And I think that's the thing, that we read scriptures like that and we think, well, that's for other people. And that's the devil's victory, when I think the word of God isn't really for me.
Yeah. I think, it's so important to pay attention to the analogies that God gives us in scripture. Yesterday, I referenced that one of the truths that came out for me in the process of losing 3 children by miscarriage was the truth from Psalm 139, when he says, you saw my unformed substance, and before any of them had come to be, you had numbered my days. And so I think when God goes to such lengths through the people that he's writing through to say things like, I knit you together in your mother's womb. When we're talking on a DNA level and a microscopic, before anybody can see anything level, and he says things like, I've numbered the hairs on your head, and as many as the stars are in the sky or the sands on the seashore. When we recognize that God is a creator of the microscopic world and the astronomical world, that he's intentional to let us know that he's involved in the tiniest of details. And when I can comprehend that he's the creator of the tiniest of details, then I can own that he authors the little things that go on every day in my life, that he's present, that he's writing a story, that he's willing to work with me in a story, and that nothing is too minuscule for his attention or for his love to reshape and to rework, for his presence to be a part of. And I think once you start to accept that, you can start to see the truths in the everyday mundane things, as well as take inspiration from the big things that happen that you're surprised by, either in your life or somebody else's life. But it's appreciating his presence. It's appreciating his ability to be in the middle of it all that allows you to see more.
That's excellent. Yeah, absolutely. And that's the thing is, we take time off from God, but God doesn't take time off from us. He always knows how many hairs are on my head. He always knows before a word is out of my mouth. He knows what it is. He always is faithful in paying attention. The question is, will I tune in today?
And he always knows like why these ones turned first. He was there for what happened when that happened. And so that has its own story. Every single one has its own story, but
that's true.
We won't go there.
I like to keep mine down here, but I say that, of course, I dye this to get the mature look, and it's taken me years to cultivate this. So you're welcome.
I just came naturally. So.
Well, God bless you. So as we process through your experiences, there were multiple times when we were talking about, okay, how do we share this? Because we have a limited time. And clearly when you have a limited time, like if I could have just done an interview, it would have been an hour and I would have reflected a lot more. Okay, Heather, you said this, let's talk more about that. But because we had such a limited time, you had to really fine tune, not talk about a lot of stories, that kind of thing. But as you think about, I was just thinking about your story with your birth mother. And I don't know how much you want to share. We didn't prep this conversation like we prepped the interview, but with that, I'm just curious what you would be willing to share. You shared this beautiful picture. What stands out to me is when you were talking about the amazing nature of this woman who had to experience isolation. You use the term loneliness, the fear, and yet the determination, that this is going to end in my child being born, and I want my child adopted. And you didn't say this, but being very specific about the family that she was looking for you, just really her intentionality. Can you talk a little bit about, or what would you be willing to share about your relationship today and maybe aspects of how that developed?
Yeah, so I'm trying to think, like, it takes nothing to imagine in our current day culture how an unwanted pregnancy results in a ton of complications in life. We have lots of laws and things that are actually built to protect sort of the inconveniences that happen when that's not wanted. And so I think it takes no imagination to realize how choosing to give birth really goes against the grain, not just culturally or legally, but you have to have some real fortitude to choose to give life. And I'm so grateful that my birth mother did that. Now, I was born in a time where closed adoption was normal. It's much more acceptable now to have open adoption and the complications that go with that. But when I was born, that wasn't the common thing. And so my reality started with the probability of not ever knowing who she was. And so through my growing up years, I probably, I alluded to this maybe a little bit, but certainly I think everybody who's adopted has some big questions about worth, value, what it meant when somebody gives somebody away, and what it doesn't mean. And I think if I'm being just honest, you spend a lifetime working out some of those questions. But I love too that is the picture God chooses to give us about becoming part of his family. That there's certainly, I think any of us who are adopted into the family of God, we question our worthiness of it. If we're really looking at the picture of who God is, I think we end up at some point questioning our worthiness of it. But then when you go back and you read these passages about God deciding before the foundations of the earth were laid that he wanted us to be a part of his family, and the lengths to which he would go to make that happen, and the delight he took in planning it. I'm grateful to have the physical experience that shadows or mirrors that spiritual one. I'm in a beautiful spot where now at 47, I get to know my birth mom, and I get to see the ways that we're alike, and appreciate the depth of who she is as a person, as a woman. And I realize I'm sensitive to the fact that not everybody gets that story.
Sure.
But for me, I get to speak to that place, and just with great gratitude, both to God for giving me that chance to know her now, and not having all the questions answered, but having a lot of questions answered, and the beauty of what that relationship has taught me in both how we could not be raised together and yet have very similar experiences in some different ways. I'm losing my camera here, sorry. But just have great appreciation for how we are similar, even though we weren't together, and how much I can mirror some parts of her, even though I never knew her growing up. And I think also that has spiritual implications. I might not have known God for a huge chunk of my life, but all of a sudden, when I start seeing how I do have a mirror image of him, I can appreciate why I belong to him, can appreciate, differences as well, but being adopted in, even with my mom that raised me, we might not have the same look in our face, although growing up, people did actually not believe when my mom and I would say I was adopted, because there were stages where we did look so much alike, and I think that even has its own neat comparison, that that we do begin to look like God when he brings us into his family. We do begin to look like our brother, Jesus Christ. We do, as we're transformed into the image of his family and who he is more holy, we reflect that regardless of where our beginning was.
That's right. Yeah. And I know we don't have time, this is a little off subject, but I just want to kind of, the rest of the story piece is that you have been able to connect with not just your birth mother, but with her family. You've been able to visit aunts and uncles. And I mean, it's really been a beautiful dynamic of just a really redemptive aspect of your life. And I love that story. It just occurred to me, this is a left, brace yourself. Okay. But it occurred to me, we didn't talk about this because she's not living, but you also have a stepmom that you didn't live with, you didn't grow up with. And just, I'm curious how, I don't know what reflection you would have. I know this is on the spot and you work better having time, but yeah, what would you say about that connection?
Yeah. I will say that having a stepmom was not something I'd ever envisioned having necessarily. I had never given it thought. I had never given it much time or attention. When that relationship came about in my dad's life, if I'm being just totally honest, I'm probably at least like one other person out there in the world who was a little bit resistant at first to just the change and things not being the way that I expected it to be. But I will say that through the years, she just became such a beautiful part of our family in her uniqueness, in the ways that she brought pieces to my family that I couldn't bring, that my siblings couldn't bring, in heart and in wholeness. Again, it's just one of those things where I sit back and I'm so grateful that God is the one who writes stories and not me, because I would never write a good story. I would write a story that's often built either around my hurt or my fear or my expectations, and God always just moves so past that. And in that particular case, I guess I should be cautious because I know not everybody has a great story, but in that particular case, I'm so grateful for what God did that I couldn't see coming, because she was a beautiful, beautiful part of our life. So.
That's good. That just occurred to me.
And
So,
I will add this,
yes.
let me add this too. I will say, even though I was an adult when she entered our family, she mothered me in ways I didn't expect, that I didn't think I even needed. You know, I was independent and an adult, and I had my own children, and wasn't expecting or maybe even wanting, you know, some of the roles that she played, but she did end up playing important roles in my life that, again, in the wisdom of God, I couldn't have seen coming, but look back now and in hindsight, deeply value.
Yeah. It is a dynamic where I feel truly privileged, both on your side of the family and my side of the family, with the way God has redeemed things. There have been a lot of hard things, still hard things, but he's very gracious, and I'm really appreciative of that. I want to make sure, I had alluded to this yesterday. We had an experience of having a foster daughter, and that obviously is it's a privilege. We ended up living with her for nearly a year. And so you had talked about just how strong she was, how, she'd just been through a lot of tough experiences. And we knew early on just how strong she was. And we also knew she had no reason to trust us. And I know a lot of foster children have experiences that would give them a signal that it's not trustworthy, to be there. And so, but God early on in our experience did something between you and her that was really, the reason I love this story is we didn't want it. we wanted to help her, but the circumstances that God used to create some connection was a very unwanted circumstance. So tell me about that.
So I'm going to tell you about that, but I want to go back to something that I think I didn't even.
This is just like when we talk at home.
It is. You should have known. I think I couldn't have imagined how it connected until I've sat and stewed on it more. But one thing that's probably important to say about my relationship with my mom, who raised me and me, is that I'm a very strong-willed, stubborn, annoying, when you get to know me, person.
No.
Thank you.
No.
Because you're still in the same room as me.
I caught me nodding. Me nodding, and I'm like,
I mean, I earned the nickname. It went back and forth between Lucy and Eeyore. So if that gives you a picture of who I was as a kid. But my mom was incredibly patient and gentle. I know she had to lose her temper, but I don't have memories of her losing her temper. Maybe a little bit exasperated, but when she got exasperated, she got quiet, and she would just endure. And certainly as a child, there were times I wanted to rile her up. I wanted to get a reaction, and yet she was stalwart. She was steady. And I don't think I appreciated how important it was for me to witness that in her mothering of me, and how critical that would become when I mothered my own children, because that spirit in me that wanted to react and wanted a reaction and wanted to jump ahead and get ahead of things and be on top of things and let no time pass before everything was taken care of, that doesn't parent well. That has to be tempered. So you were mentioning this story, and I think about our foster daughter. She had a very similar spirit, and maybe that's why I was so drawn to her, because she was just this tough cookie, and stood out as her own person from the get-go, even though she was young, and I can remember when we brought her into our home. I mean, it wasn't very long. She hadn't been in our home very long before our family faced a bout of lice. And before that happened, I can remember thinking, God, why mosquitoes and why lice? Like, there's a whole lot I can understand, but someday I would love, in all humility, to get an explanation for that, for why those things exist, why they were created. But a couple weeks, like I said, just a little bit into her time here, our family ended up facing a bout of lice. And so nightly, I took hours, literally, combing through the hair of each child. And that process was, because I am a go, 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 get it done person, that process was painful to me. I felt insecure about, am I doing this right? I hadn't done it before. It just took a lot of time. I felt like life was way too busy to suddenly have the brakes slammed on by this process. And yet it was just a couple nights into that routine of combing and setting the chair up in front of the TV for each kid, or sitting on the back porch for each kid and combing for hours, that I realized, oh my goodness, this gives us uninterrupted talk time. And I can remember our foster daughter saying to me something simple about, hey, thank you for not cutting my hair off, because I know that could have been an easy thing to do. And the girls both had long hair at the time, and so it was a bit more of a process. And just her being grateful, but this tough cookie, this walls built up and hard to reach. It was the night after night of the combing and the gentleness and the tenderness and the talking that ended up being the inroad into that tough little heart. And it made me appreciate that God does author stories in ways that we wouldn't. I would have thought that just talking enough, or just asking enough questions, or there's a million things that I could have thought would have been the inroad that weren't, to getting to know who she was and giving her space, even with me, to tell me who she was. And I think God does that all the time.
Yeah, I think that what's fascinating is, if you think about your main connections in life, the vast majority of time, you've gone through very difficult things with them, sometimes against them, like you're at odds, but at the very least with them. And here's what's interesting: as soon as your life stabilizes, as soon as you feel you've got a norm, you do everything in your power to avoid hard things. You try, if I just have enough money, I'll never have to, do a job I don't want to do. If I just have my own this, if I just have my own that. And it's fascinating that the very things that would make us grow, we work so hard to ensure does not happen. And I think I love that story, because number one, we went through foster care training. And do you know how many times it came up? So when your children get lice, that never came up, and we went through a lot of trust training and how do you bridge gaps, and how do you have good understanding, and all that was useful. But it's just like God, that whatever it is you're not expecting, he uses that very thing to bring about his will, which is always, God's will is always some manifestation of love, some deepening of love. And that's one of the things I just love about that story. And we could talk about our kids and say, what are the close spaces we have with our children? And we could link those to difficult times, almost every single one of them, difficult times. And I just think that's a beautiful thing for me to notice. So today, when I'm going through a hard thing, I tell myself, this is God showing how he's going to love me through this. And oftentimes it's God showing how he's going to connect me with someone else. And I just love that.
I can think of a time in the interview yesterday, I had shared the big picture that God has given me through parenting our kids of, there's that initial teaching right and wrong. And then eventually over the course of time, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, but eventually over time, perfect love drives out fear. And one of the things I didn't have time to share, but that came to my mind in thinking through all these questions again that you had prepared, was I can remember a time when Eli was 3-ish, I think, little guy, and he had disappeared. And so I went looking for him, and he was in the back bedroom, and had done something wrong. I can't even remember, and this is, I think, also parenting, I can't remember what had even happened. But what I remember was his posture. He was hiding whatever had happened, and he was kind of bent over and not wanting me to see it. And that became, God used that picture of him to talk to me about his relationship with me. Because only in that moment did I know that my little 3-year-old was hiding from something I could clean up in 10 minutes. It took nothing for me to take care of the situation. And yet he was afraid and he was ashamed. And in that moment, he was more motivated by those things than his knowing that I would be the person who could take care of it all, and that I would love him and I would teach him, but I wasn't rejecting him, that, and yet that posture was what stuck in my head watching him, because God really did speak to me about, Heather, this is how you hide from me. This is how you assess right and wrong. And I have gone to such lengths to be in a relationship with you. I need you to see the wholeness of who I am, not just the mistake you made, because the mistake you made will crush you if you think you're the only one to clean it up. But if you can understand that I am here and I'm your parent and I have this immense amount of love and you belong to me in a way that you can't even comprehend yet, that such that I will go to the ends of the earth for you, then that reshapes, everything that we feel. And of course, my tiny little 3-year-old guy couldn't understand that. But as a mom, I did get it in that moment in the way God wanted me to hear it from him. And that picture's always stuck with me. And I think God does that again through motherhood, through the ways we reflect in how our moms related to us, either positively or negatively. And sometimes we do have to rewrite stories about who God is because we didn't get positive interactions. And it's good for us to acknowledge that and say that out loud so that we can give God a chance to reveal himself to us in the perfect character that he has towards us, and maybe not the ones that have been demonstrated to us. But again, there's so much where he can reveal, if we're, like you said earlier, if we're willing to see it and we're willing to look. There's so many just built-in examples of what he's trying to teach us in the big picture, through what we do in a day.
Yeah, absolutely true. I'm really struck by thinking through the different interactions that I've had with the kids, and just noticing even now with fresh eyes. Okay, that reminds me of God in this, and that reminds me of God in that. And it's like anything. If I hear about something, there's a certain level of awareness I have, but if I'm actually experiencing something, that is a much deeper awareness. Much more likely to be retained, much more likely to change my perspective. And I think that's especially parents with young children. I really can't encourage you enough. Ask God every day to show you. Show me you, show me Jesus, show me your spirit. Not once I get the kids down. I think we kind of feel like once I get my job done, then I'll look for God. And God's like, do you realize like almost every single story in the Bible, the people were in the middle of doing their job when God showed up? Like if they had waited to see God till after they were done with their work, they would have never seen him. It was in their work. And I think, especially to young moms, or to and to dads too, but to young parents, I just would encourage you, have that prayer with your teenagers. If you have teenagers, I can't encourage you enough. Terry Rush used to tell us early on, you remember, expect joy, expect God to bring joy. And it did change things, because I think we're taught a lot in our culture to fear teenage years, fear the battles that will come. And we had battles, but our mode was to expect God to show up, expect God to share joy. And I think that has just blessed us enormously with our relationship with our kids now that they are adults.
I agree. I think one of the most critical things that I took in from other people, just on the lower story part of parenting, was that, don't be afraid of the teenage years. This isn't them against you. This is them becoming them, and you're still aiding them in that process. And I think one of the things that makes me think of translate part of that parenting again into the upper story is that now that my kids are older, and as they got older, as they were able to communicate appreciation to me, Simple things from I love you to notes that were written or a card that was written. There is a unique joy that comes when your kids spontaneously write something to you or about you that's truly from their heart, that's truly from a memory they have, and sure, we all do the, and they need to, the little cards that everybody helps them write, but when they get to that place where they can truly express from their own heart their relationship with you, there's nothing like it. There's just nothing like it. And again, once more, that makes me see God wants that from me too. Like there is a specific delight when I slow down my day and I say to him out loud, not just take for granted all the things that have come along in his provision for me and his generosity towards me, but when I slow down enough to say, God, I saw this today, and I thank you because I saw you working in this, and I realized you were being this way to me, and I get it, and I'm grateful. And so even when you feel like those years are hard, your kids are teaching you. They don't stop teaching you about things that you're learning about your own relationship with God.
Yeah, 100%. I think what is really wonderful is at 50, for me, 50 years old, I get this so much more than I did at 40. And I am super excited what I'll get at 60 and 70 and whatever God gives us. And I think this dynamic, the world teaches us to expect to be more depressed, expect to feel worse and worse and worse. And physically, certainly God says, through Paul, he says, though outwardly we are wasting away. And man, we already feel that at times, even at our age. But inwardly we're being renewed day by day. And that idea of believing, God, you are making all things new all the time. You referenced the Revelation passage yesterday in our interview, but I think that is so important about our disposition about the future, that I am not waiting to die, but I'm excited to see his face. I am really excited. And whatever time he gives me from now till the day I see his face, he means to. And so if he gives me 40 years more, he meant to. And so and that's teaching years. All those are rich teaching, experiencing God years. And so we have to keep reframing what the world says is, okay, these are your productive times and everything's kind of downhill. We even talk in terms of you're over the hill now. Well, over what hill? I'm not over the hill. And because my spirit, I just occupy this body, like God, I'm primarily spirit. I'm in this tent, as Paul would say for now. And I think that affects so much how we age and the value we see. And what you said about our teenagers, when our teenagers and young adults, they push back against us. Maybe they even push back against our belief in God. We want them to do that with us. When your child says, I don't even believe there is a God, I'm not suggesting that should make you happy, but it's not a judgment on how you've taught them. It's them exercising what you've given them. Because really, until I have the freedom to say, I don't believe in God, then I don't really have the freedom to say I believe in God truly. Because up to that point, I didn't feel like I had a choice. And I think that's one of the things of reframing our parenthood, but taking it back to God's motherhood. A good mom, and I'm talking about the best of the best, so I'm not meaning to shame any mom that wouldn't do it this way, but when we imagine an ideal mom, we would come at our mom with whatever in our angsty years, whatever mine are 50s are my angsty years now, but for most teenagers, we would want to be able to come at them and be, I'm really angry about this, and then be comforted.
Right.
And to expect less of God. No, my mom could do that for me, or my grandma, or whoever was meaningful to you, but God wouldn't. I'm like, God's the one that came up with motherhood. So don't tell yourself God's sitting there going, I can't believe it, even if your mom did do that.
And God's not panicked by the questions. And I think that that's a huge thing to understand. When our daughter died, and again, we shared this yesterday, you didn't go through the same process that I did. But when I faced that, I really had a real struggle with understanding the character of God, and then eventually even believing that there was God. And sure, that started as questions and accusations in my relationship with God, and then withdrawal, and then confusion, and then isolation, and just turning inward. And I think that looks like a teenager sometimes, because they're trying to establish if you're really as trustworthy as they hoped you were. And as they run into, now I don't think God has this, but my children do run into my weakness and my inadequacy, and that's okay that they run into that. Now I ran into that in my questions about God, and God had to very gently. God didn't run away when I was afraid and angry, and he didn't answer all of my questions right when I asked them either. He was patient and he was gentle, and certainly my questions were so big it took time for him to rebuild little by little. And so, and I was only willing to take the truths that I could actually get. And so I think about how God parented me during my years of disbelief. And then I apply that to my kids, instead of being panicked when suddenly they don't believe something I believe, or they're making mistakes I just desperately don't want them to make. I'm reminded of how patient God was with me and how present he always could be found. And sometimes I wasn't willing to look, and that's okay. And sometimes I was willing to look, and I had to be ready and present for my kids when they're ready to ask a question. And I have to be just as present and patient when they're not, so that they, over the course of time, can see my trustworthiness, just as God presented his trustworthiness to me. And the faith I have now, like I've said many times, is a deeper, stronger faith that includes disappointment, that includes anger and loss, because I realize this world isn't all we're meant for. It's a part, but it is not the wholeness of all that God intends to give us. And so I will face disappointment in what I experience here. And he wants me to know that, because he also wants me to know there is something more he always had to offer us. And so he wants me to want that, just like I want my kids to understand and have the beauty of all I could ever want for them. But also I have to recognize I can't give it to them. I can't give them everything God wanted them to have. So they're going to face disappointment too, and they need to find wholeness in him, and they need to be able to see that in me, the faith I have is in a God who can bring wholeness too. So
that's excellent. Well, I know you were worried when I said, yeah, this usually takes about 30 minutes. And now we're at about 40 minutes. I told you you would like it. So, and having said that, I feel like we could go another hour easy, just on things that have been said that I'm like, oh, that makes me think of, like what would happen if God answered you every single time you ask him a question, and how you would not ask him questions because his answer would be so jarring. He would teach you not to ask any more questions. So how much grace does he show us by not answering us when we ask these hard questions, that we think we are due, and we deserve the answers to? Well, I just want to say, bless you for doing this, for choosing to be vulnerable, both on Sunday and for this video. I know you to be a true woman of God. Since one of the first times I met you, our first conversation at that picnic table in Lubbock, Texas, you just showed such tenacity and care. It was this really unique blend, and I really honor and bless that in you, that you have brought that to your motherhood, and it showed me a lot about God, in the way that you care for everybody, but in particular children. I've just learned an enormous amount about parenting just watching you, and when I wasn't resisting your messages, it was really helpful. So thank you for that. Okay, thank you for joining the post-sermon convo world. You can add this to your resume. It's in the small line, put it at the very end for things that I endured. And so we're appreciative of that. You have a great week.